On the highest point overlooking Gull Lake in southwestern Michigan, 110 feet above the water, stands a Tudor palace of 15,000 square feet. Its builder, one of the wealthiest men in America, called it simply the cottage. The man who built this estate spent the first 46 years of his life as a servant. He worked 120-hour weeks for minimal pay. He took dictation while his employer sat on the toilet. He ran alongside his boss's bicycle, notebook in hand, ready to record any passing thought. The employer was his own brother. In 1906, everything changed. The servant became a titan of industry. The invisible bookkeeper built a company that would put his signature on breakfast tables across America and around the world. By the time he constructed this lakeside palace in 1925, W.K. Kellogg had become a household name. His brother, the famous doctor who had once treated presidents and titans, was suing him for the right to use their shared family name. The two brothers would fight in court for years. They would barely speak for decades. And in the final days of the older brother's life, a letter of reconciliation would arrive at this very house. W.K. Kellogg never opened it, not until it was too late. This is the story of cornflakes, family betrayal, and the price of success. It begins here, at the cottage by the lake. In 1925, W.K. Kellogg was 65 years old and finally rich beyond imagination. His cornflakes company was producing 120,000 boxes every single day. After a lifetime of poverty and servitude, he decided to build something for himself. He chose a spot 15 miles from Battle Creek at Gull Lake. The property sat on the highest elevation overlooking the water, covering 32 acres with 1,600 feet of private shoreline. Kellogg hired the architectural firm Benjamin and Benjamin from Grand Rapids to design his retreat. He wanted something that looked like it had stood for centuries. The architects delivered a neo-Tudor masterpiece. The exterior featured authentic half-timbered walls with stucco panels, exactly as one would find on a manor house in the English countryside. Leaded glass windows with heraldic shields caught the morning light from the lake. The roof was clad in Ludovici tiles, imported and expensive, topped with terracotta chimney finials that gave the silhouette a distinctly old-world character. But Kellogg was not content with the house alone. He transformed the entire property into a gentleman's estate. A Dutch windmill rose from the grounds, purely decorative but perfectly authentic in its details. Nearby stood a greenhouse where roses, citrus fruits, and flowers grew year-round, supplying fresh bouquets for the manor house daily. Down by the water sat a boathouse, and elsewhere on the property, a pagoda added an unexpected oriental accent to the English landscape. Kellogg was impatient. When the landscapers suggested planting young trees that would mature beautifully over time, he refused. At my age, he told them, you can't wait for trees to grow. He ordered fully mature trees transplanted onto the property instead. He wanted his paradise complete, and he wanted it now. The man who built this estate had spent decades watching others enjoy the fruits of his labor. His brother had lived in comfort while W.K. balanced the books. Now, finally, he had something of his own. He called it the cottage. The name was either extreme modesty or a private joke, perhaps it was both. The 15,000-square-foot Tudor palace, with its windmill and greenhouse and boathouse, was to a man who had grown up with nothing and expected nothing, simply a cottage by the lake. But to understand how W.K. Kellogg came to build this place, we must go back to where it all began. We must return to Battle Creek and to the two brothers whose bond would shape the American breakfast and whose hatred would last a lifetime. Battle Creek, Michigan in the 1860s was no ordinary American town. While the rest of the nation recovered from civil war and chased industrial fortunes, this small city in the southwestern corner of the state had become the spiritual headquarters of a religious movement convinced that the world was about to end. the Seventh-day Adventists had gathered here by the thousands. They believed the second coming of Christ was imminent. The Seventh-day Adventists rejected meat, alcohol, tobacco, coffee, and tea. They observed the Sabbath on Saturday rather than Sunday, and they believed that the human body was a temple that must be kept pure for the Lord's return. In this community, John Preston Kellogg made brooms and raised his family. John Preston and Ann Jeanette would have 16 children. 6 of them died from infectious diseases. The children who survived grew up in an atmosphere of religious devotion and constant anxiety about health, death, and divine judgment. John Harvey arrived on February 26, 1852. He contracted tuberculosis as a child, and his left lung would remain largely useless for the rest of his life. But what he lacked in physical robustness, he made up for in intellect. The Adventist church leadership noticed him early. They saw potential and decided to invest in his education. 8 years later, on April 7, 1860, Will Keith Kellogg was born. He was the 7th of the 16 children. From the beginning, his path diverged sharply from his older brothers. Where John Harvey was celebrated, Will Keith was overlooked. Where John Harvey received sponsorship and opportunity, Will Keith received chores and low expectations. The problem was his eyes. Will Keith could barely see the blackboard at school. His teachers assumed he was slow. His family assumed he was dim. Nobody thought to check his vision. The boy who would one day build a business empire spent his childhood labeled as the family's disappointment. At 13, Will Keith dropped out of school. His father put him to work selling brooms door to door. The teenager learned to pitch products to skeptical housewives, to handle rejection, to calculate margins and manage inventory. His brother was headed to medical school, while he was selling brooms. John Harvey's trajectory could not have been more different. The church sent him to study at the Hygiotherapeutic College in New Jersey, then to the University of Michigan Medical School, and finally to Bellevue Hospital Medical College in New York City. He returned to Battle Creek in 1876 as a fully credentialed physician, 24 years old, ready to take charge of the Adventist health institution that would make him famous. The Western Health Reform Institute had been founded a decade earlier to put Adventist health principles into practice, but it was struggling. The church elders needed someone with vision and medical credentials to transform it. John Harvey Kellogg was their man. He immediately renamed it the Battle Creek Medical Surgical Sanitarium. The word "san," as everyone came to call it, would become the most famous health resort in America. That same year, 1876, 16-year-old Will Keith Kellogg walked through the doors of his brother's institution. He was not there as a patient, he was there as an employee. John Harvey needed someone to keep the books, and the arrangement would last 25 years. The doctor stood 5'4" tall and dressed entirely in white suit, white shoes, and a white tie. On his shoulder often sat a white cockatoo, and behind his round spectacles, a pointed beard gave him a distinctive appearance that patients and staff never forgot. John Harvey Kellogg was arguably the most famous physician in America. His Battle Creek Sanitarium had grown from a struggling Adventist clinic into a massive campus covering 30 acres with more than 30 buildings. The main structure alone could house 1,300 patients, supported by a staff of nearly 1,000 employees, including 30 physicians. The people who filled those rooms were not ordinary patients. They were the architects of the American century. Presidents William Howard Taft, Warren G. Harding, and Calvin Coolidge all came to Battle Creek seeking restoration. Thomas Edison arrived when his mind needed rest, while Henry Ford and Harvey Firestone escaped the pressures of business within these walls. Amelia Earhart prepared for her historic flights here, and John D. Rockefeller, Jr. sought refuge after the Ludlow massacre had stained his family's reputation. The San had become the place where America's elite went to be cleansed of the impurities of modern life. On February 18, 1902, at 3:48 in the morning, disaster struck when a fire broke out in the main building. The flames spread rapidly, forcing the staff to rouse 407 sleeping guests and evacuate them into the freezing Michigan night. Remarkably, only one person died, an elderly man who had unwisely gone back inside for his belongings. The loss was estimated at $400,000, most of it uninsured, but John Harvey Kellogg was undeterred. He rebuilt on an even grander scale, opening a new sanitarium in May 1903. Designed in the Italian Renaissance style, the facility eventually included a 14-story tower that dominated the Battle Creek skyline by 1928. This physical manifestation of Kellogg's philosophy of health, which began and ended with digestion. Kellogg believed that 90% of all human disease originated in the stomach and intestines. His solution was simple and uncompromising: clean them out. He invented an enema machine capable of pumping 15 quarts of water through a patient's bowels in a single minute. Patients received multiple enemas daily, a practice Kellogg himself followed religiously every morning and at midday. Water alone was not enough for the doctor's vision of internal purity. Kellogg believed the intestines needed to be colonized with beneficial bacteria. His solution was yogurt, administered from both ends. Patients consumed half a pint by mouth, while the other half was pumped directly into the rectum to establish healthy flora throughout the entire digestive tract. For patients who needed additional stimulation, there was the vibrating chair, a wooden seat that shook the body at up to 60 oscillations per second. The violent trembling was designed to promote bowel movements, and it often succeeded immediately and involuntarily. The sanitarium also featured light therapy cabinets that bathed patients in the glow of dozens of electric bulbs, and sinusoidal machines that sent mild electrical currents through their bodies. Mechanical horses provided exercise for those too weak to ride real ones, a device President Coolidge enjoyed so much that he had one installed in the White House. But John Harvey Kellogg's deepest obsession was not the bowels, it was sex. He had married Ella Eaton in 1879, but the marriage was never consummated. The couple maintained separate bedrooms for their entire lives, fostering 42 orphans and legally adopting 8 instead of having biological children. John Harvey Kellogg's obsession with bodily purity extended far beyond diet. It was a crusade against what he called the solitary vice. He believed that masturbation was the root of numerous physical and mental ailments, including poor posture, acne, heart palpitations, epilepsy, and even insanity. To combat this, he published best-selling books and lectured to packed auditoriums on extreme preventative measures. For boys, he advocated for circumcision performed without anesthesia, believing the pain would create a beneficial association in the child's mind to deter future urges. In more severe cases, he even recommended suturing the foreskin shut. For girls, his prescriptions were equally harrowing, including the application of carbolic acid to the clitoris. These were not fringe ideas whispered in secret, they were foundational to the sanitarium's mission. The entire dietary program at the San was designed in part to suppress sexual desire. Kellogg theorized that heavy, flavorful, or spicy foods inflamed the passions, while a bland, simple diet would keep the body calm and the urges dormant. This specific pursuit of a libido-suppressing food led directly to the accidental discovery of the world's most famous cereal. Do me a quick favor. Hit subscribe and hype the video so you don't miss our next deep dive, and let's get right back into the moment. The birth of cornflakes was not a stroke of culinary genius, but a laboratory accident born from the brothers' search for a digestible, bland health food. In the mid-1990s, while experimenting with various grains to create a digestible bread substitute for sanitarium patients, the brothers left a batch of cooked wheat sitting out too long. When they eventually put the stale grain through the rollers, instead of a long sheet of dough, it shattered into thin, crisp flakes. To their surprise, when toasted, these flakes were light, crunchy, and popular with the patients. They soon applied this process to corn, creating the prototype for the modern cornflake. while John Harvey saw this strictly as a medical tool, a way to facilitate biologic living and keep the patient's internal systems uninflamed. W.K. Kellogg saw something entirely different. He saw a product that could revolutionize the American breakfast table. For years, W.K. urged his brother to commercialize the product for the general public, but John Harvey resisted, fearing that turning the sanitarium's health secrets into a business would tarnish his medical reputation. This fundamental disagreement on the purpose of their invention became the first major crack in their relationship. By 1905, W.K. Kellogg had reached his limit. He was 45 years old and had spent a quarter-century living as a ghost in his brother's machine. In his diary, he wrote, "I feel kind of blue. I am afraid that I will always be a poor man the way things look now." He had watched other men, like C.W. Post, a former patient at the sanitarium, take the ideas they learned in Battle Creek and turn them into multi-million-dollar empires. W.K. was the one who managed the books. He knew exactly how much money was being left on the table because of his brother's ego and medical dogmatism. The daily humiliations continued unabated. The dictation sessions in the bathroom, the requirement to address his own flesh and blood as Dr. Kellogg, and the 120-hour workweeks. On February 19, 1906, W.K. finally made his move. He founded the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company. He managed to buy out his brother's interest in the cereal business, essentially purchasing his freedom. John Harvey, ever the elitist, barely noticed the departure. To him, the cereal was a sideline, a dietary tool, while his real work was the sanitarium. He let his dim-witted brother take the flakes, convinced that without his medical prestige, the venture would surely fail. When W.K. Kellogg walked away from the sanitarium to start his own company, he didn't just change his career, he changed the recipe. John Harvey had insisted that the cereal remain a strictly pure health food, bland, sugarless, and medicinal. W.K., with his years of experience selling brooms and managing the Sands books, knew that the average American did not want to eat medicine for breakfast. He made a decision that John Harvey viewed as a high betrayal of their Seventh-day Adventist upbringing. He added sugar and salt. This single choice transformed the product from a niche health food into a culinary phenomenon. Within a year, W.K. was selling 1 million cases of Kellogg's Toasted Cornflakes. To distinguish his product from the dozens of imitators popping up in Battle Creek, including the Post Toasties produced by their former patient C.W. Post, W.K. began a massive advertising campaign. He famously printed his own signature on each box with the slogan, "The original has this signature, W.K. Kellogg." It was a declaration of independence, but to John Harvey, it was an act of war. By 1910, the Kellogg name was the most valuable asset in the cereal world. John Harvey, seeing his younger brother's staggering success, decided he wanted a piece of the glory. He began marketing his own line of Kellogg's health foods through the sanitarium, leveraging his international fame as a doctor to confuse consumers. He claimed that because he was the famous Dr. Kellogg, the name belonged to him. W.K. countered that his massive advertising budget, which had reached $1 million a year, was the only reason the name meant anything to the public. The dispute landed in the Michigan courts and dragged on for an agonizing decade. The brothers, who lived just a few blocks from each other in the same small city, ceased all personal communication. Every interaction was filtered through high-priced lawyers. The local community watched in shock as the town's two most prominent figures spent their fortunes trying to strip the other of their identity. The legal battle finally reached the Michigan Supreme Court in 1920. The justices were tasked with a bizarre question: who owned a family name? John Harvey argued from a position of intellectual and moral superiority, portraying W.K. as a mere clerk who had stolen a doctor's discovery. However, the court saw it differently. They ruled that W.K. Kellogg's commercial genius and vast investment in advertising had given the name Kellogg a secondary meaning in the minds of the public. To the average American, Kellogg's meant the cereal in the box, not the doctor in the white suit. WK was granted exclusive rights to use the name Kellogg for cereal products. It was a total victory for the dim-witted younger brother and a crushing humiliation for the world-famous physician. John Harvey was ordered to stop using the name on his commercial food products, a blow to his ego that would never truly heal. With the legal victory secured, W.K. Kellogg leaned entirely into his identity as the original. He understood that in a world of imitators, the consumer needed a mark of trust. He began an advertising blitz that was unprecedented in the early 20th century. He didn't just buy newspaper ads, he bought the largest neon sign in the world at the time, placed in New York City's Times Square. The sign featured his signature, the same one that appears on boxes today, stretching 106 feet wide. This signature wasn't just a logo, it was a middle finger to his brother. It was WK's way of saying that while John Harvey had the degrees and the fame, he had the people. The dim-witted brother was now one of the most successful businessmen in the world, and he used his signature to colonize the American pantry. Every time a mother reached for a box of cornflakes, she saw WK's name, effectively erasing the doctor from the cultural consciousness of the breakfast table. While WK's empire was expanding, John Harvey's sanitarium began a long, slow decline. The San had always been a reflection of the Gilded Age, a place for the ultra-wealthy to indulge in expensive health fads. But the world was changing. Scientific medicine was advancing, and many of John Harvey's theories, like the auto-intoxication of the colon, were being debunked by a new generation of doctors. Then came the Great Depression. The titans and presidents who once flocked to Battle Creek suddenly found themselves with less disposable income and less patience for 15-quart enemas. The sanitarium, once a gold mine, began to hemorrhage money. John Harvey, never a man of fiscal restraint, refused to scale back. He continued to live like royalty while the institution's debts mounted. By the early 1930s, the sanitarium was forced into receivership. The Temple of Health was crumbling, and the brother who had once been the master was now facing the very poverty he had once imposed on WK. As his brother's institution faced bankruptcy, W.K. Kellogg sought a different kind of sanctuary. He moved away from the constant reminders of the family feud in downtown Battle Creek and retreated to his cottage at Gull Lake. The 15,000-square-foot manor was more than a home, it was a fortress of solitude. W.K. had become a deeply private, almost reclusive figure. He spent his days walking the 32-acre grounds, tending to his roses, and watching the Dutch windmill turn. He filled the house with the finest craftsmanship, hand-carved oak paneling, custom-molded plaster ceilings, and a massive pipe organ that echoed through the stone halls. It was a place where he could finally play, reclaiming the leisure time he had lost during the 25 years he spent running alongside his brother's bicycle. But the silence of the house was also a reflection of his personal life. His success had come at the cost of his family. He had grown distant from his children, and the bitterness of the war with John Harvey seemed to have seeped into his bones, making him a difficult, demanding patriarch. W.K. Kellogg's cottage was not merely a house, it was a psychological restoration project. After 25 years of being denied play and forced to live under his brother's thumb, W.K. used his millions to build a world he could finally control. The estate at Gull Lake featured a custom-built organ with 3,000 pipes, allowing the music to swell through the limestone halls at the touch of a button. He became obsessed with the minutiae of the grounds, frequently patrolling the 32 acres to ensure every rosebush and every inch of the shoreline was perfect. Yet, despite the opulence, W.K. remained a man of Spartan habits. He rarely hosted the lavish parties typical of the Gilded Age. Instead, he lived a life of quiet, almost monastic discipline, often eating a simple bowl of his own cornflakes for dinner. The mansion was a monument to his victory over his brother, but it was also a gilded cage for a man who had forgotten how to truly relax. The tragedy of the Kellogg family was that the cycle of coldness and control did not end with the brothers. It passed down to the next generation. W.K.'s relationship with his own son, John Leonard Kellogg, was a mirror of the trauma he had endured under John Harvey. John Leonard was a brilliant innovator in his own right, credited with developing the process for all bran and various packaging improvements that saved the company millions. However, WK was a demanding and unforgiving father. In 1925, the same year the Gull Lake Mansion was completed, a personal dispute erupted between father and son. WK, in a fit of rage and disappointment, fired John Leonard from the company and effectively banished him from the family business. It was a move that echoed John Harvey's dismissal of WK decades earlier. The invisible bookkeeper had become the Iron Chairman, proving that even a billion-dollar fortune could not buy a break from the family's pattern of emotional abandonment. As the 1930s drew to a close, the man who had built an empire on sight and marketing began to lose his most precious tool. W.K. Kellogg developed glaucoma, a condition that slowly narrowed his world until he was plunged into total darkness. By the time he was 80, the master of the Gull Lake estate was completely blind. He could no longer see the 106-foot neon signature in Times Square or the meticulously manicured roses on his property. This physical darkness coincided with a deepening loneliness. John Harvey was still alive, living in the ruins of his sanitarium empire, and the two brothers remained locked in a stalemate of silence. W.K. spent his final years being led through his mansion by attendants, a titan of industry who could command millions of dollars, but could not see the hand in front of his face. He became a benefactor of the blind, donating millions to eye research and the training of leader dogs, perhaps hoping to spare others the isolated darkness that now defined his own existence. In 1943, as the world was consumed by the fires of World War II, John Harvey Kellogg found himself facing his own end. At 91 years old, the once indomitable doctor was bedridden with bronchitis, his lungs, weakened since childhood, finally failing him. In a rare moment of humility, the man who had spent a lifetime demanding to be called master and doctor took up a pen. He wrote a long, rambling 7-page letter to his brother, W.K. It was a confession. He admitted that he had been overbearing, that he had mistreated W.K. during those 25 years at the sanitarium, and that he regretted the decade of legal warfare that had severed their bond. It was the letter W.K. had waited a lifetime to receive, an acknowledgement of his worth and an apology for his servitude. He mailed it to the cottage at Gull Lake, a final attempt to bridge the chasm before the darkness took him. The letter arrived at the Gull Lake estate during a time of deep isolation for W.K. Kellogg. Now 83 years old and completely blind, W.K. was entirely dependent on others to navigate his world. When the mail arrived, his assistants would typically read it aloud to him. However, the relationship between the brothers was so toxic and the history of their legal battles so painful that W.K. had developed a reflexive defense mechanism against anything originating from John Harvey. When he was told a letter had arrived from the doctor, W.K. did not ask for it to be read. Perhaps he feared another legal threat or another lecture on biologic living. He instructed his staff to set it aside. For days, the most important document in the history of the Kellogg family sat on a mahogany table, unopened and unread, while John Harvey's life ebbed away in a hospital bed just a few miles away. John Harvey Kellogg died on December 14, 1943. It was only after the news of the doctor's death reached the mansion that W.K. finally asked for the letter to be opened and read to him. As he sat in the darkness of his blindness, listening to the voice of his assistant recount his brother's late-life apology, the weight of the tragedy settled in. The reconciliation he had earned through decades of struggle was now impossible to voice back. The two men, who lived in the same small city and shaped the same global industry, had missed their final window for peace by mere hours. W.K. reportedly wept upon hearing the contents of the letter, realizing that the silence between them was now permanent. The master was gone, and the servant was left alone in a 15,000-square-foot palace built on the foundations of their shared discovery and their mutual hate. W.K. Kellogg outlived his brother by 8 years, passing away in 1951 at the age of 91. He left behind a company that had fundamentally altered the way the world ate. The Kellogg's signature, once a weapon in a fraternal war, had become a global symbol of reliability. But W.K.'s true legacy wasn't just in the cereal box, it was in the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which he established in 1930. Having been denied a proper education and professional respect for the first half of his life, he dedicated his massive fortune, nearly $66 million at the time, to the health and education of children. He famously said, "I'll invest my money in people," a poignant reversal from the years he spent as an invisible cog in his brother's medical machine. The servant had become the ultimate provider, ensuring that the name Kellogg would be associated not with enemas and vibration shares, but with philanthropy and opportunity. In Oak Hill Cemetery in Battle Creek, there is a physical representation of the brothers' lifelong tension. John Harvey and W.K. are buried just feet apart in the family plot. In life, they lived in the same city but occupied different universes. One of clinical purity and ego, the other of industrial might and private pain. In death, they are returned to the same soil, side by side. Visitors to the cemetery often note the irony. The two men who could not stand to be in the same room for 40 years are now locked in an eternal proximity. It is a silent conclusion to a saga that proved family blood is often less powerful than personal pride. Today, the grand 14-story tower of the Battle Creek Sanitarium still stands, but it no longer echoes with the sounds of vibrating chairs or the lectures of a man in white. Following its bankruptcy during the Depression, the building was purchased by the federal government and turned into the Percy Jones Army Hospital during World War II. Later, it became a federal center. It stands as a massive limestone ghost of a health movement that once captivated the world's elite. While the sanitarium's specific medical practices are now viewed as eccentric footnotes in history, the institution's core idea that diet and lifestyle are the primary drivers of health became a foundational pillar of modern wellness. John Harvey Kellogg was a fanatic, but he was also a prophet of the multi-billion-dollar wellness industry that exists today. Battle Creek, Michigan remains Cereal City, but the landscape has changed. The massive factories that once puffed and toasted grain for the entire world have scaled back or modernized into quiet, automated facilities. Yet the presence of the brothers is inescapable. You see it in the W.K. Kellogg Auditorium, the Kellogg Community College, and the international headquarters that still bears that famous flowing signature. The city is a living monument to a fraternal feud that inadvertently created a global breakfast staple. It is a place where the local economy was built on the back of a servant who finally decided he had taken enough orders. What W.K. Kellogg understood, perhaps better than his doctor brother, was the sensory experience of food. While John Harvey focused on the biologic utility of the grain, W.K. obsessed over the crunch. He perfected the toasting process so that the flakes wouldn't just turn into mush the moment milk hit the bowl. This stay crisp factor was a technological marvel of the early 1900s. It wasn't just about nutrition, it was about the sound, the texture, and the reliability of the experience. He turned breakfast into an engineered event, moving the meal from the chaotic, heavy spreads of the 19th century into the standardized, efficient era of the 20th. In the shadow of the war between John Harvey and W.K. sits the story of the other Kellogg siblings, specifically Hester and the others who remained in the Adventist fold. While the two brothers were battling for control of the name and the fortune, their siblings often found themselves caught in the crossfire or ignored entirely. The wealth generated by cornflakes created a massive disparity within the family. While W.K. lived in a 15,000-square-foot mansion, some of his relatives continued to live the modest, austere lives prescribed by their faith. The twisted story is often framed as a duo, but it was a family-wide fracturing that left some members as billionaires and others as mere footnotes. W.K. Kellogg didn't just sell cereal, he sold a new American lifestyle. Before his massive advertising campaigns, breakfast was either a heavy, time-consuming affair of porridge and meat or something skipped entirely. W.K. used his servants' understanding of the common person to market cornflakes as the ultimate labor-saving device for the modern housewife. He was one of the first to use sampling on a national scale, giving away millions of miniature boxes to prove the product's quality. He also pioneered the use of premiums, the small toys and prizes inside the box, to hook the next generation of consumers. By the 1940s, he had turned a bland, anti-sex health food into a symbol of American efficiency and childhood joy. Despite their global success and secular business empires, neither brother ever truly escaped the shadow of their Seventh-day Adventist upbringing. The San was built on Adventist health reform, and the cereal empire was funded by it. Even as they drifted away from the church's strict theological grip, the core tenets of purity, abstinence, and hard work remained their driving forces. John Harvey saw himself as a high priest of health, while W.K. functioned with the tireless, joyless work ethic of a man trying to outrun his own insignificance. The twisted nature of their story is rooted in this religious intensity. They took the church's mandate to perfect the body and turned it into a weapon to wield against one another. After W.K. Kellogg's death in 1951, the 15,000-square-foot cottage at Gull Lake entered a new chapter. Consistent with W.K.'s philanthropic vision, the estate was eventually deeded to Michigan State University. It became the Kellogg Biological Station, a center for research and education. The rooms where W.K. sat in blindness, listening to the late apology of his brother, are now used for academic conferences and public tours. The windmill still stands, and the mature trees W.K. was too impatient to wait for have now reached their full, towering height. The mansion, once a monument to a man's private victory over his brother, now serves the common people W.K. always claimed to represent. The cornflake itself has undergone a transformation that would likely horrify John Harvey. Today's cereal aisle is a technicolor explosion of sugar, frostings, and marshmallows, a far cry from the digestible wheat intended to curb human passion. Yet the foundational technology the brothers discovered, the process of flaking grain, remains the industry standard. Whether it is a healthy bran flake or a sugar-coated loop, the mechanical lineage traces directly back to that accidental batch of stale wheat in the sanitarium. The brothers' discovery created a multi-billion-dollar category that defined the industrialization of the human diet. The 10-year legal war over the name Kellogg remains one of the most significant trademark cases in American history. It established the legal precedent for secondary meaning, the idea that a person's name can become so associated with a product that the individual loses the exclusive right to use it for other commercial purposes. For John Harvey, the cost was his identity. He spent his final years as a famous doctor who wasn't allowed to put his own name on his food. For W.K., the cost was his family. He won the name, but lost his brother, his son, and the peace of his golden years. The saga concludes at Oak Hill Cemetery, a quiet plot of land in Battle Creek where the grass is meticulously trimmed. Here, the doctor and the servant lie within whispering distance. Their headstones are modest, belying the massive egos and even larger fortunes they commanded in life. The story of the Kellogg brothers is a reminder that the things we build, empires, palaces, and global brands, often outlast the people we love and the relationships we break. As the sun sets over Gull Lake and the lights of the Kellogg factory flicker on in the distance, the brothers remain as they were for 40 years, side by side, yet worlds apart, forever bound by a signature and a flake of corn.